Welcome to the RPTM podcast, the show that breaks down the myths of monolithic history and tells our story through multiple lenses. I'm your host, Professor Ryan Lancaster. Today's episode is partially underwritten by you, the listener. Find out ways to support the podcast on my website, ryanglancaster.com. Episode 12, Music, Books, Fire and Brimstone, and Pirates. Rule number 9 of history, tear down your idols. The idea of statues is so frustrating for a historian as they create an internal war within us. I have been known to stop and read every placard on every statue in every town I go on vacation with my family. As I read about the historical importance of whatever mundane event or person is being given credit, I can hear both the collective groan of boredom and the eyes rolling back into the head of my wife and children. What can I say? I like statues. But the sad reality is some of these statues should not exist. Historically speaking, the figures were created initially as shrines to deities. These go all the way back to when man first learned how to chisel into rock. But then eventually, as society aged, so did people's taste. The dreaded politician or emperor or king also wanted to be immortalized for centuries. This blurred the lines of fact and reality. Gods were perfect, humans were not. The statue seems to neglect the fact that these very fallible people did very ordinary things, very mundane things. Next time you see a statue of Nero, remember he also pooped. But the unfortunate truth is these enshrined leaders also did terrible things to others. And it seems that we as humans remove any sort of onus or responsibility for horrific actions made by men in bronze statues. We must tear down statues, metaphorically of course, please don't catch a charge on my account. Remember that fallible people are in charge always, and just because you are on a pedestal, you should not be removed from the court of opinion. This goes for every person in a position of power, regardless if they are marbleized or not. It makes me sick to my stomach to see or read all the people who venerate politicians, mostly if they ignored all the war crimes and human rights that have been violated in the state's name. It makes you wonder, does everyone or does no one deserve a statue? In the words of Shelley from his epic poem Ozymandias, "Look upon my works, ye mighty, and despair." Music, Part 2. Religion and music often co-join when we look at their humble beginnings. The Great Awakening and other hymnal styles in New England spread south and changed from Reverend John Wesley's strict formulas. John Cennick, known for his widespread hymns like "Jesus, my all to heaven is gone," and John Newton are likely the two most essential individuals in creating Great Awakening era hymns, which were sung at camp meetings. These hymns, sung at large gatherings, especially in the South, provided a basis for gospel and blues in the late 19th and early 20th century. Some of the standard features included Cennick's innovation of hymns sung as a dialogue, as well as Newton, a former slave trader who converted after reading The Imitation of Christ by Thomas A. Kempis, who wrote more than 200 hymns that drew on his own experiences wrestling with sin and proved extremely popular. Compared with the older songs, Wesley and new composers wrote with a simple structure. Rural farmers and workers expanded on these structures, creating intricate pieces that some musical conservatives railed against to no avail. In this context, a wave of intricate singing masters, including William Billings, arose, creating hymns that remain standard across the country. This field was called the First New England School. The First New England School is usually considered the first uniquely American invention in music. The most characteristic feature was that the voices, male and female, doubled their parts in any octave to fill out the harmony. This generated a texture of close position chords unknown in European traditions. The great urban centers of the Mid-Atlantic included cities like Philadelphia and Baltimore, and it was there that European classical traditions were best represented. At the time, professional musicians were looked down upon and considered coarse. Gentlemen performed often played, mostly for those aristocratic audiences and without pay. As the United States developed, the South became the land of deep socioeconomic divisions. Land ownership and the possession of chattel slavery became an integral component of a gentleman's livelihood. Simultaneously, in the North, the idea of a landed aristocracy never carried as much weight. The Appalachian Mountains have been a center of cultural innovation, despite only sparse settlement by Native Americans and Europeans. Due to complex geologic reasons, the mountains and subranges were challenging to cross and included ridges of uninhabitable quartz mixed with valleys soil, which made it unsuitable for agriculture. As a result, Europeans and their African slaves immigration tended to be southern in the direction, along the Piedmont area, and poor Europeans populated the Appalachian region. These Europeans were of English, Scotch, Irish, German, and Huguenot origins. This settlement occurred primarily from 1775 to 1850. English, Anglo-Irish, border Scottish tunes, and ballads continued evolving from their distant roots along the Appalachians, eventually forming the primary basis for jug bands, country blues, hillbilly, and other genres, which ultimately became country music. These folk tunes adopted characteristics from multiple sources, including British broadside ballads, which switched their themes from love to a distinctly American preoccupation with masculine work like mining or sensationalistic disasters and murder, African folk tunes and their lyrical focus on semi-historical events, and minstrel shows and music halls. Popular ballads included Barbara Allen and Mattie Groves. The banjo was also introduced, having gone through numerous geographic movements since its invention by the Arabians and subsequent travel across Africa, the Atlantic, and throughout the Americas. Appalachian fiddle systems are mostly derived by those brought to the colonies by English settlers. The Appalachian technique was altered during the next century, with European waltzes and polkas being most influential. Jonathan Edwards. As the Great Awakening swept across Massachusetts in the 1740s, Jonathan Edwards, a minister and supporter of George Whitefield, delivered what would become one of the most famous sermons from the colonial era, "The Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God." The sermon featured a frightening central image, the hand of an all-powerful God dangling a terrified believer over a fiery pit, ready on the moment's notice to drop him into the flames of eternal damnation. Edwards hoped his sermon would wake up the faithful and remind them of the terrible fate that awaited them if they failed to confess their sins and to seek God's mercy. Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God eclipsed Edwards' more critical contribution to religion in America. The son of and grandson of preachers, he became not only a minister, but also one of the greatest theologians in American history. His precocious intelligence and range of intellect were evident early on. He learned Latin, read Newton's optics, and wrote about rainbows and spiders' captivating moment. Reveling in nature, he found a divine glory in almost everything. He described his own religious experience in almost mystical terms, as being swallowed up by God. A prodigious writer, Edwards produced volumes of sermons, journals, and observations. His capacious mind engaged two persistent religious questions that transcend time. What is the nature of spiritual experience? What is the source of religious authority? The question of expertise arose with urgency during the Great Awakening. Heeding Whitefield's call and his followers, men and women frequently engaged in vivid displays of emotional excess, often accompanied by extreme bodily movements. Boston minister Charles Chauncey sharply criticized his behavior, arguing that the overheated imaginations were tricking people into calling the result true religion. Reason, not emotion or animal instinct, he argued, must govern religious experience. Jonathan Edwards demurred. In his Treatise of Religious Affectations, he defended the place of emotion in religious experience not as animal instinct, but as part of human will. At the same time, he questioned whether subjective experience alone could serve as a source of religious authority. He concluded that individuals could not rely solely on their own spiritual experience, however luminous it appeared. Satan, Edwards warned, stood ever ready to appeal to human self-centeredness. By the time he died in 1758, Edwards had left behind a formidable body of work that addressed topics that have occupied Christian thinkers for nearly 2,000 years. The nature of sin, the will, and virtue. As his biographer Perry Miller noted, Edwards treated these topics, quote, in the manner of Augustine, Aquinas, and Pascal, not as problems of dogma, but of life. Early 18th century literature. In America in the early years of the 18th century, some writers, such as Cotton Mather, carried on the older traditions. His huge history and biography of Puritan New England, Magnalia Christi Americana, in 1702, and his vigorous introduction to the ministry in 1726 were defenses of ancient Puritan convictions. Jonathan Edwards, the initiator of the Great Awakening, a religious revival that stirred the eastern seacoast for many years, eloquently defended his burning belief in Calvinistic doctrine of the concept that man, born depraved, could attain virtue and salvation only through God's grace. In his powerful sermons, and most notably in the philosophical treatise of Freedom of Will, he supported his claims by relating them to a complex metaphysical system and brilliantly reasoning in clear and often beautiful prose. But Mather and Edwards were defending a doomed cause. Liberal New England ministers such as John Wise and Jonathan Mayhew moved towards a less rigid religion. Samuel Sewall heralded other changes in his amusing diary, covering the years 1673 to 1729. Though sincerely religious, he showed in daily records how commercial life in New England replaced rigid Puritanism with more worldly attitudes. The journal of Madame Sarah Kemble Knight comically detailed a journey that she took to New York in 1704. She wrote vividly of what she saw and commented upon it from an Orthodox believer standpoint, but the quality of fun in her witty writing showed that she was much less vigorous than the Pilgrims' founders had been. In the South, William Byrd of Virginia, an aristocratic plantation owner, contrasted sharply with gloomier predecessors. His record of surveying trip in 1728, The History of Dividing Line, and his account of a visit to his frontier properties in 1733, A Journey to the Land of Eden, were his chief works. Years in England, on the continent, and among the South's gentry had created joy and grace of expression, and, although a devout Anglican, Byrd was as playful as the Restoration wits whose works he admired. The wrench of the American Revolution emphasized differences that had been growing between American and British political concepts. As the colonists moved to the belief that rebellion was inevitable, fought the bitter war, and worked to found the new nation's government, they were influenced by several very influential political writers, such as Samuel Adams and John Dickinson, both of whom favored the colonists, and loyalist Joseph Galloway. But two figures loomed above these, Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Paine. In 1706, Franklin had started to publish his writings in his brother's newspaper, the New England Courant, as early as 1722. This newspaper championed the cause of the leather apron man and the farmer and appealed using easily understood language and practical arguments. The idea that common sense was a useful guide with apparent in both the famous Poor Richard's Almanac, which Franklin edited between 1732 and 1757, and filled with prudent and witty aphorisms purportedly written by uneducated but experienced Richard Saunders. In the author's autobiography, written between 1771 and 1778, a record of his rise from humble circumstances that offered a worldly wise suggestions for future success. Franklin's self-attained culture, deep and wide, gave substance and skill to varied articles, pamphlets, and records concerning the dispute with Great Britain. Many of them were extremely useful in stating and shaping the colonists' cause. As the colonies moved toward independence from Britain, an essential discussion of American culture and identity came from the French immigrant J. Hector St. John de Creveture, whose Letters from an American Farmer addresses the question, what is an American? By moving between praise for the opportunities and peace offered in the new society and recognition that the stable life of the farmer must rest uneasily between the oppressive aspects of the urban life and the lawless aspects of the frontier, where the lack of social structures leads to the loss of civilized living. The same period saw the beginning of black literature through the poet Phyllis Wheatley and the same narrative of Olaudah Equiano, the interesting narrative of the life of Olaudah Equiano. At this time, American Indian literature also began to flourish. Samson Occam published a sermon preached at the execution of Moses Paul in a popular hymn book, collections of hymns and spiritual songs, the first Indian bestseller. '18th century philosophy. 18th century American philosophy may be broken into two halves, the first half being marked by the theology of Reformed Puritan Calvinism influenced by the Great Awakening and Enlightenment natural philosophy, and the second by the native moral philosophy of the American Enlightenment taught in American colleges. They were used in the tumultuous years of the 1750s and 1770s to forge a new intellectual culture for the United States, which led to the American incarnation of the European Enlightenment associated with the political thought of the Founding Fathers. The 18th century saw Francis Bacon and the Enlightenment philosophers Descartes, Newton, Locke, Wollaston, and Berkeley to colonial British America. Two native-born Americans, Samuel Johnson and Jonathan Edwards, both previously mentioned, were first influenced by these philosophers. They then adapted and extended their Enlightenment ideas to develop their American theology and philosophy. Both were initially ordained Puritan Congregationalist ministers who embraced much of the new learning of the Enlightenment. Both were Yale-educated and Berkeley-influenced idealists, who became influential college presidents. Both were influential in the development of American political philosophy and the works of the Founding Fathers. But Edwards based his Reformed Puritan theology on Calvinistic doctrine. Simultaneously, Johnson converted to the Anglican Episcopal religion, or the Church of England, then based his new American moral philosophy on William Wollaston's natural religion. The 18th century saw more reliance on science and the new learning of the Age of Enlightenment, along with an idealistic belief in the perfectibility of human beings through teaching ethics and moral philosophy, laissez-faire economics, and a new focus on political matters. Samuel Johnson has been called the father of American philosophy, and is first important philosopher in colonial America and author of the first philosophy textbook published there. He was interested in philosophy and theology, but in theories of education and knowledge classification schemes, which he used to write encyclopedias, develop college curricula, and create library classification systems. Johnson was a proponent of the view that the essence of true religion is morality, and believed that the problem of denominationalism could be solved by teaching a non-denominational common moral philosophy acceptable to all religions. So, he crafted one. Johnson's moral philosophy was influenced by Descartes and Locke, but more directly by William Wollaston's religion of nature, delineated, and the idealistic philosopher of George Berkeley, with whom Johnson studied with Berkeley, was in Rhode Island between 1729 and 1731. Johnson strongly rejected Calvin's doctrine of predestination and believed that people were autonomous moral agents endowed with free will and Lockean natural rights. His fusion philosophy of natural religion and idealism, which has been called the American Practical Idealism, was developed as a series of college textbooks in 7 editions between 1731 and 1754. These works and his dialogue Raphael, or the Genius of English America, written at the time of the Stamp Act crisis, go beyond his Wollaston and Berkeley influences. Raphael included sections on economics, philosophy, psychology, the teaching of women, and political philosophy. His moral philosophy is defined in the college textbook Elementa Philosophica as the art of pursuing your highest happiness by the practice of virtue. It was promoted by President Thomas Clapp of Yale, Benjamin Franklin, and Provost William Smith at the Academy and College of Philadelphia, and taught at King's College, now Columbia University, which Johnson founded in 1754. It was influential in its day. It has been estimated that about half of American college students between 1743 and 1776, and over half of the men who contributed to the Declaration of Independence, or debated it was connected to Johnson's American Practical Idealism moral philosophy. 3 members of the Committee of 5 who edited the Declaration of Independence were near related to Johnson. His educational partner, promoter, friend, and publisher Benjamin Franklin of Pennsylvania, his King College student Robert R. Livingston of New York, and his son William Samuel Johnson's legal protege, and Yale treasurer Roger Sherman of Connecticut. Johnson's son William Samuel Johnson was the chairman of the Committee of Style that wrote the U.S. Constitution. Edits to a draft version are in his hand in the Library of Congress. Piracy, Part 2. Between 1713 and 1714, a succession of peace treaties were signed, which ended the Spanish Succession War. With the end of this conflict, thousands of seamen, including Britain's paramilitary privateers, were relieved of military duty. The result was many trained, idle sailors when the cross-Atlantic colonial shipping trade was beginning to boom. Also, Europeans who had been pushed by unemployment to become sailors and soldiers involved in slaving were often enthusiastic to abandon that profession to turn to piracy, giving pirate captains for many years a constant pool of trained European recruits to be found in West African waters and coasts. In 1715, pirates launched a major raid on Spanish divers trying to recover gold from a sunken treasure galleon near Florida. The pirates' force's nucleus was a group of English ex-privateers, all of whom would be enshrined in infamy. Henry Jennings, Charles Vane, Samuel Bellamy, and Edward England. The attack was successful, but contrary to their expectations, the governor of Jamaica refused to allow Jennings and their cohorts to spend their loot on his island. With Kingston and the declining Port Royal closed to them, Jennings and his comrades founded a new pirate base on Nassau, on the island of New Providence in the Bahamas, abandoned during the war. Until the arrival of Governor Woodes Rogers 3 years later, Nassau would be home to these pirates and their many recruits. Shipping traffic between Africa, the Caribbean, and Europe began to soar in the 18th century. The known model is known as the triangular trade and was a rich target for piracy. Trade ships sailed from Europe to the African coast, trading manufactured goods and weapons in exchange for slaves. The traders would then sail to the Caribbean to sell the slaves and return to Europe with sugar, tobacco, and cocoa. Another triangular trade saw ships carrying raw materials, preserved cod, and rum to Europe, where a portion of the cargo would be sold for manufactured goods, which, along with the remainder of the initial load, were transported to the Caribbean, where they were exchanged for sugar and molasses, which, with some manufactured articles, were borne to New England. Ships in the triangular trade made money at each stop. In place of the peace settlement for the War of the Spanish Succession, Britain obtained an asiento, a Spanish government contract to supply slaves to Spain's New World colonies, providing British traders and smugglers more access to the traditionally closed Spanish markets in America. This arrangement was contributed heavily to the spread of piracy across the West Atlantic at the time. Shipping to the colonies boomed simultaneously with the flood of skilled mariners after the war. Merchant shippers used the surplus of sailors' labor to drive wages down, cutting corners to maximize their profits and creating unsavory conditions aboard the vessels. Merchant sailors suffered from higher mortality rates than slaves being transported. Living conditions were so poor that many sailors began to prefer a freer existence as a pirate. The increased volume of shipping traffic also could sustain a large body of brigands preying upon it. Among the most infamous Caribbean pirates were Edward Teach, or Blackbeard, Calico Jack Rackham, and Bartholomew Roberts. Most of these pirates were eventually hunted down by the Royal Navy and killed or captured. Several battles were fought between the brigands and the colonial powers on both land and sea. Piracy in the Caribbean declined for the next several decades after 1730. By 1810s, many pirates roamed the waters, though they were not as bold or successful as their predecessors. The most successful pirates of the era were Jean Lafitte and Roberto Confresi. Lafitte was considered by many to be the last buccaneer due to his army of pirates and fleet of pirate ships, which held bases in and around the Gulf of Mexico. Lafitte and his men participated in the War of 1812 Battle of New Orleans. Confresi's base was on Mona Island, Puerto Rico, where he disrupted the commerce throughout the region. He became the last primary target of the international anti-piracy operations. England began to firmly turn against piracy at the turn of the 18th century, as it increasingly damaged the country's economic and commercial prospects in the region. The Piracy Act of 1698, for the more effectual suppression of piracy, made it easier to capture, try, and convict pirates by lawfully enabling acts of piracy to be examined, inquired of, tried, heard, and determined, and adjudged in any place at sea or upon land, in any of His Majesty's islands, plantations, colonies, dominions, forts, or factories. This effectively enabled admirals to hold a court session to hear the pirates' trials in any they deemed necessary, rather than requiring that the trial be held in England. Commissioners of these vice admiralty courts were also vested with full power and authority to issue warrants, summon the necessary witnesses, and to do all things necessary for the hearing and final determination of any case of piracy, robbery, and felonies. These new and faster trials provided no legal representation for the pirates, and ultimately led in this era to the execution of 600 pirates, which represented approximately 10% of the pirates active in the Caribbean region. Being an accessory to piracy was also criminalized under the statute. Piracy saw a brief resurgence between the end of the War of the Spanish Succession in 1713 and around 1720, as many unemployed seafarers took to piracy to make ends meet when a surplus of sailors after the war led to a decline in wages and working conditions. At the same time, one of the terms of a treaty that ended the war gave to Great Britain's Royal African Company and other British slavers a 30-year asiento, or contract, to furnish African slaves to the Spanish colonies, providing British merchants and smugglers potential inroads into the traditionally closed Spanish markets in America and leading to an economic revival for the whole region. This revived Caribbean trade provided rich new pickings for a wave of piracy. Also contributing to the increase of Caribbean piracy was Spain's breakup of the English logwood settlements at Campeche and the attractions of a freshly sunken silver fleet off the southern Bahamas in 1715. Fears over the rising levels of crime and piracy, political discontent, concern over crowd behavior at public punishments, and an increased determination by Parliament to suppress piracy resulted in the Piracy Act of 1717 and 1721. These established 7-year penal transportations to North America as a possible punishment for those convicted of lesser felonies, or as a possible sentence that capital punishment might be commuted to by the royal pardon. After 1720, piracy in the classic sense became extremely rare as increasingly effective anti-piracy measures were taken by the Royal Navy, making it impossible for any pirate to pursue an influential career for long. By 1718, the British Royal Navy had approximately 124 vessels, with 214 by 1815, a significant increase from the 2 boats England had possessed in 1670. The British Royal Navy warships tirelessly hunted down pirate vessels and almost always won these engagements. Even though pirates raided many ships, few, if any, buried their treasure. Often the treasure that was stolen was food, water, alcohol, weapons, or clothing. Other things they stole were household items like bits of soap and gear like ropes and anchors. And sometimes they would keep the ship they captured, either to sell off or to keep it because it was better than their craft. Such items were likely to be needed immediately rather than saved for future trade. For this reason, there was no reason or need for the pirates to bury these goods. Pirates tended to kill few people aboard the ships they captured, usually. They would kill no one if the ship surrendered. If it became known that pirates took no prisoners, their victims would fight to the last breath and make victory both very difficult and costly in lives. In contrast, ships would quickly surrender if they knew they were going to be spared. In one well-documented case, 300 heavily armed soldiers on a ship attacked by Thomas II surrendered after a brief battle, with none of II's 40-man crew being injured. Many pirates did not surrender and were killed at the point of capture. Notorious pirate Edward Teach, or Blackbeard, was hunted down by Lieutenant Robert Maynard off the coast of North Carolina on November 22nd, 1718, and was killed. His flagship was captured French slave ship known originally as the Le Concorde. He'd renamed the frigate Queen Anne's Revenge. Bartholomew Roberts was cornered in 1722 at Cape Lopez, and a fatal broadside from the HMS Swallow killed the pirate captain instantly. Roberts' death shocked the pirate world, as well as the Royal Navy. The local merchants and civilians had thought him invincible, and some considered him a hero. Roberts' death was seen by many historians at the end of the golden age of piracy. Also crucial to the end of this piracy era was the loss of pirates' last Caribbean safe haven at Nassau. Once pirates were caught during the 17th and 18th centuries, justice was meted out in a summary fashion. Many ended their lives by dancing the hempen jig, a euphemism for hanging. Public execution was a form of entertainment at the time, and people came out to watch them as they would a sporting event today. Newspapers reported details such as condemned men's last words, the priest's prayers, and descriptions of their final moments in the gallows. In England, most of these executions took place on the execution dock on the River Thames in London. In the cases of more famous prisoners, usually captains, their punishment extended beyond death. Their bodies were enclosed in iron cages and left to swing in the air until the flesh rotted off them, a process that could take as long as 2 years. The body of captains such as William Captain Kidd, Charles Vane, William Fly, and Jack Rackham, or Calico Jack, were all treated this way. While piracy was predominantly a male occupation throughout history, a minority of pirates were female. Pirates did not allow women onto their ships very often. Additionally, women were often regarded as bad luck among pirates. It was feared that the male members of the crew would argue and fight over the women. On many ships, women and young boys were prohibited by the ship's contract, which all crew members were required to sign. Because of the resistance to allowing women on board, many female pirates did not identify themselves. For example, Anne Bonny dressed and acted as a man while on Captain Calico Jack's ship. She and Mary Read, another female pirate, are often identified as being unique in this regard. However, many women dressed as men during the golden age of piracy to take advantage of many rights, privileges, and freedoms exclusive to men. Unlike traditional Western societies, many Caribbean pirate crews of European descent operated as limited democracies. Pirate communities were some sort of first to instate checks and balances similar to the ones used by present-day United States and many other countries. The first record of such a government aboard a pirate sloop dates back to the 17th century. A privateer or corsair used similar methods to pirate, but acted under orders of the state while in possession of commission or letter of marque and reprisal from the government or monarch authorizing merchant ships' capture belonging to an enemy nation. For example, the United States Constitution of 1787 specifically authorized Congress to issue letters of marque and reprisal. The marque and reprisal message was recognized by international convention and meant that a privateer could not technically be charged with piracy while attacking the targets named in his commission. This nicety of law did not always save the individuals concerned, however, since whether one was considered a pirate or a legally operating privateer often depended on whose custody the individual found himself in. That of the country that had issued the commission or of the object of attack. Spanish authorities were known to execute foreign privateers with their marque letters hung around their necks and emphasized Spain's rejection of such defenses. Furthermore, many pirates exceeded the bounds of their letters of marque by attacking nations whose sovereign was at peace, and thus made themselves liable to conviction for piracy. However, a letter of marque did provide some cover for such pirates, as plunder seized from neutral or friendly shipping could be passed off later and taken from enemy merchants. Privateers constituted a large portion of the total military force at sea during the 17th and 18th century. During the 9 Years' War, the French adopted a strongly encouraging French corsairs policy, including the famous Jean Bart, to attack English and Dutch shipping. English lost roughly 4,000 merchant ships during the war. In the following War of Spanish Succession, privateers' attacks continued, Britain losing 3,200 merchant ships. During the War of Austrian Succession, Britain lost nearly 3,000 merchant ships, and France lost 3,400 merchant ships to the British. During King George's War, approximately 36,000 Americans served aboard privateers at one time or another. During the American Revolution, about 55,000 American seamen served aboard the privateers. The American privateers had almost 1,700 ships, and they captured 2,200 enemy ships. Between the end of the Revolutionary War and 1812, less than 30 years, Britain, France, Naples, the Barbary States, Spain, and the Netherlands seized approximately 2,500 American ships. Payments in ransom and tribute to the Barbary States amounted to 20% of the United States government annual revenues in 1800. Through the American Civil War, Confederate privateers successfully harassed Union merchant ships. You've been listening to the RPTM podcast. If you like what you hear, please rate us on whatever platform you're listening on. Join us again next week when we talk about the seen and unseen of U.S. history. Make sure you subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode. Also, for more information, check out the show notes on my website. The show was produced by me. Our editor is me. Written and researched by me. Music is Down South by Bliv Beats. I'm Ryan Lancaster, and this was the RPTM podcast.